Alhamdulillah, I will first I wish to thank Brother Hussein for having organized this, and of course Brother Aizuddin also for setting up the link, and for everyone else um, who's generous with your time, agreeing to meet on a short notice. I expressly asked Hussein to include within this meeting only those who I know and who knows me, and I've asked him if I can include certain other names like Brother Al-Wardi and Sister Zakia, Sister Aisha, and several others. Uh, well, this is themed as a catching up with Brother Muhiyuddin. But if you know me well by now, I'm not one for much of small talk. So I decided to do a sharing on the responsibilities of knowledge and knowing. Uh, Amongst the books I think I've been reading lately, which I find very important in the realm of epistemology or the theory of knowledge, is Professor Wa'il Hallak's Restating Orientalism. If you've heard of Orientalism by Edward Said, now this work by Professor Wa'il Hallak is a response to that work. What Edward Said had done is a monumental critique of the discipline of Oriental studies amongst Western scholars. What he has done is to show that more than an objective, um, more than an objective study, or beyond what they claim to be an objective study of the Orient, Orientalism is in fact more a reflection of what they wish to perceive of the Orient, be it and especially when they study the Muslims, but also Eastern cultures generally. They mixed into their studies their own conceptions of their racial superiority, their rational superiority compared to the Eastern mystical and mysterious tendencies. So what Edward Said had caused was I suppose, a major a major shake-up in the world of the humanities. Now, many decades later, after perhaps the dust have begun to settle, not without changing the entire discipline and really affecting the discipline, there has been, I think, very powerful defenses by some Orientalists who tried to respond to Edward Said. When we were in Cassis, Professor Zaini said for us, perhaps it was Robert Irwin's For Lust of Knowing. Robert Irwin, what he tried to do was to defend Orientalism based on its merits. According to him, in spite of the weaknesses inherent in the colonialist project, because many of the Orientalists, they serve colonial interests and imperial interests and the interests of sovereign nation states in their study of the Islamic East. In spite of the weaknesses, the realm of Oriental studies has gone to publish and done very important works in at the very least in providing critical editions of long lost texts, in reviving some texts like the study of Ibn Khaldun. Even, for example, if you look at some of the best Orientalists, they have even influenced how later Muslims saw their own scholars. Take, for example, studies on al-Haddad by Louis Massignon, and then later on the studies of Ibn Arabi by several others, by several Orientalist scholars that influence to the extent that some Azhari scholars would translate these works from French into Arabic because of their, I suppose, their genuine contributions to Islamic studies, area studies, historical studies, and several other interrelated disciplines under the umbrella of the study of Islam. So what Robert Irwin tried in his passion defense for Orientalist scholarship or the study of Islamic studies in the West is that he's saying that the whole enterprise has been maligned unfairly by Edward Said because it's capable of critical self-reflection, evolution, and improvement, such that whereas the earlier scholars may have malintent and a taint of settled aversion against Islam, especially when you look at scholars such as Joseph Schacht, scholars such as Ignaz Goldziher, and several others, even Bernard Lewis, who became advisors to their own governments in their policies of imperialism. Yet the whole discipline or the whole enterprise has produced genuine scholars whose sole interest was scholarship per se. They might not do it lillahi ta'ala, they might not believe in those things, and some of them might do it out of boredom, but their contributions have been genuine. Take, for example, Franz Rosenthal, whose translation of the Muqaddimah gave access to many Muslims as well as non-Muslims around the world to the works of Ibn Khaldun, and his meticulous research in Islamic historiography is also something commendable. Meaning to say, he studied all the major works of Tariq, of history, and then published a study of that. And he headed a committee in translating the entirety of Tariq at-Tabari. And for Muslims who lack the basic facility of Arabic, this is a genuine contribution that is undeniable. Not to mention his very important study on knowledge triumphant, basically a study of the culture and the definition of knowledge in Islamic intellectual tradition. So Robert Irwin has a point, but yet no one can really say that Orientalism survived the critique of Edward Said until perhaps what Wa'il Halak has now done in maybe the last 5 years. What Halak had done in his restating Orientalism is to put Edward Said to work. In that what he does is to expose Edward Said's own weaknesses. In that Edward Said is not critiquing critiquing Orientalism from an independent perspective or from an independent epistemology outside of the shall we say outside of the general so back to Halak's critique or exposition of Edward Said is basically what he's saying is that while exposing the weaknesses of the particular venture of Orientalism, he said that Said has not gone far enough in that basically he's part and parcel of the general epistemic project of modernity, of which Orientalism is a mere extension. Yes? Meaning to say, while criticizing the weaknesses of Orientalism, what Said fails to see is that in using his own humanistic tendencies and other epistemic projects of modernity, meaning to say the modern secular Western conception of knowledge, he is in himself perpetuating the greater malaise surrounding Western knowledge, shall we say. So what then did Professor Halak manage to expose? Well, what he did in restating Orientalism is to show that what needs to happen is the understanding of the new conception of knowledge that emerged in Western culture and civilization after the Renaissance period. In other words, the shift of their worldviews from the medieval period, in the time of, St. Augustine, followed by the higher Middle Ages of Thomas Aquinas, from a God-centered worldview, they shifted to first a God and world-centered worldview. Until then, it became a world-centered worldview. When it became a world-centered worldview, there came a new conception of knowledge. Whereas in the previous conception, with God at the center, there is part and parcel of that conception of knowledge, man's ennoblement as a result of the pursuit of knowledge. There is part and parcel the pursuit of greater ethical nobility. And this is true of all major traditions of knowledge, including that of Islam. In the Islamic and the Eastern traditions of knowledge, the pursuit of knowledge is for the sake of self-betterment, for the sake of knowledge of God, for the sake of improving one's character, for the sake of understanding one's religion. So the exponents of knowledge are people who invite people to improving themselves. But with the new impetus coming from Western culture and civilization, this goal of self mastery, of self improvement, became undercut by the new conception of knowledge for world domination or domination of the material world. And once we see this general project, yes, the will to power, yes, in Friedrich Nietzsche's words, what we then see is that the whole modern Western project of knowledge and studies and learning is for no other reason than domination and the pursuit of raw and brute power. The only difference lies in how this power is won and for whom it is won. If it's a cult of individualism, then you have it enshrined in the likes of Friedrich Nietzsche and later on Ayn Rand and the others who pursue liberalism to its maximum of the individual. On the other hand, there are pursuit of power for collectives, such as say for the working class, yes, the proletariats, and this is pursued in the Marxist communist revolution. And even then, you can have some subtle differences amongst themselves. You have those who vie for the vanguard political party, who support accordingly the cause of the proletarians, and there are others who work for the ratchet of the earth, like Franz Fanon, and even several Muslims who became influenced by these movements. Yes, like Ali Shariati, who coined the term mustad'afin, yes, in defense of the oppressed. In the end, knowledge becomes a power discourse, and this is what Professor Halak is trying to establish, that we must return to the conception of knowledge of self as self improvement, as opposed to knowledge as world domination. Now, with that very brief introduction on the terrain of knowledge, the project of Professor Said Naqib al-Attas is I think very important for us to situate, because even before Wa'il Halak and at about the same time as Edward Said, slightly earlier, because I remember Edward Said benefited from the research of the brother of Professor Naqib al-Attas. Edward Said, in his Orientalism, cited Professor Hussein al-Attas's myth of the lazy natives to show the colonialist portrayal of the locals and their imperial use of power to subjugate the locals. But what Professor Naqib al-Attas had done in just one chapter, and that is the 5th chapter of Islam and Secularism, the chapter on de-Westernization of knowledge, is to state the real problem that needs to be addressed, the problem of knowledge. And to remind you of what Professor Wan has already pointed out in the past few years, this chapter is included in the Kranlana program in Australia for leadership trainings, or for the training of leaders, in which this Kranlana leadership program gathers together the best writings on knowledge from various civilizations, including that of the Chinese, the Indian, and the modern Western. So Professor Naqib al-Attas's de-Westernization of knowledge is included therein, because of the sheer courage and the sheer, shall we say, originality of the idea, especially because of the vantage point. Professor Naqib al-Attas's chapter, The De-Westernization of Knowledge, states very boldly that for the first time in history, the real problem is the problem of knowledge. And that not as juxtaposed against ignorance, but knowledge which has been misconceived, according to Prof. al-Attas. Knowledge which, instead of bringing peace, instead of bringing calmness, instead of establishing justice, produces confusion, produces error, and brought about injustice. And injustice in this sense is not limited to just the realm of human beings, or the kingdoms, the animal kingdoms, but also that of the vegetable kingdoms and even the mineral kingdoms. Meaning to say, all aspects of the realm of sensible experience became affected by this new conception of knowledge that brought about chaos. Very interesting how this relates to the Quranic verse, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, ظهر الفساد في البر والبر في البر والبحر بما كسبت أيدي الناس. Chaos or corruption, destruction became apparent in the ocean as well as on land due to what has been earned by the hands of man. And the hands of man in this case, yes, follows his false conception of knowledge, follows his arrogant will to power. So this grand project, yes, or rather this corruption that we see today, is only a consequence of that false conception. It's very difficult to go past the symptoms that we see today, yes, like the pandemic, like the catastrophes of political injustices, the problems of economic injustice, the problem of say the depreciation and the corruption of, or rather the depletion of natural resources, the problem of inevitable climate change, and other such problems. These are rooted in that false conception of knowledge. So amongst the primary tasks of knowledge in our time is included two things, I would say. First and foremost is to liberate yourself of the false conception of knowledge. And second, to pursue the correct concept, to pursue and to ennoble yourself with the correct conception of knowledge. Have we encountered something like this in the Islamic intellectual tradition? There is something akin to that in the time of Imam al-Ghazali, but nothing of this scale. In Imam al-Ghazali, what he managed to spell out, what he managed to portray, was the problem of the restriction and the corruption of key terms. He saw that knowledge, al-ilm, al-fiqh, became derailed of its original intention, because as ilm initially within its conceptual structure was meant to be something sacred, the pursuit of which is meant to produce the fear and consciousness, awareness and love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It became reduced to the pursuit of a type of nobility for which a person aims to be identified with. Meaning to say, those who restricted the meaning of knowledge pursued even religious knowledge for the sake of say, for example, the betterment of his economic and social position. That's already a false conception of knowledge, meaning a false pursuit of knowledge. And Imam al-Ghazali coined a special term for these pseudo and false scholars. He called them ulama as-su, evil scholars, or they are ulama bid-dunya, those who use their worldly knowledge for the sake, their religious knowledge for the sake of the world. And although the corruption may not have been apparent in the physical sense, arguably, compared to what is now seen, by no means have they not basically have they not performed an action whose consequences were grave. Let us say, before the coming of Islam, what the followers of Western Christianity had done, based on the Quranic narrative, what they had done was to commit the gravest sin, and that is not just shirk, but to say about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala what they possess no knowledge of. Meaning to say, there is according to our scholars, there are grades of sins. There is something called the fahisha. The fahisha are sins which relate to say immoral or inappropriate behavior pertaining to the inability to curtail your desires. Yes, fahisha, like zina. Yes, innahu kana fahisha. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said. It's fahisha is one level. And then there is a higher grade, which includes things such as theft, and harming others, because now it is now not only the inability to restrain yourself, but it involves also actively hurting others. Higher than which includes al-ithim wa dhanb, but the highest in grade is ashirik. But even higher than that is to say about God what you have no knowledge about. And so, in order to portray to us, or in order to suggest to us the gravity of this sin, Allah Subhanahu wa Taala said about, for example, their claim that Jesus was the Son of God. Allah said in the Quran that, yakadu samawatu yatafattarna, the heavens are almost split asunder. Even the mountains couldn't bear the weightiness of the evil that they have committed. And da'u lirrahmani walada, when they have claimed for God having sired a child. Now these are already, meaning to say, if you look at the Quran, there are already evidences of how corruption of knowledge is the biggest sin. Yes, the corruption of knowledge, especially pertaining to knowledge of God. Now, in our time, this corruption became, because out of that their initial corruption, it became more and more apparent as time did its work, with the Renaissance, and then the Enlightenment, the gradual discovery by Western men that he has been left with himself. This new conception of knowledge is destructive to themselves. It is destructive to the world, and it is very difficult to say this, but it is now up to the Muslims really to renew our dialogue with the West. But we will not be able to do so until we have performed our original and most important task, which is to pursue knowledge on the right footing, to pursue knowledge with the right technique and method, to pursue knowledge with the right pathway. And Alhamdulillah, fortunately for us, our predecessors, as well as our contemporary major scholars, have written tracts. So over and above the pursuit of, say, sacred knowledge, we must try to inculcate within ourselves readings of great works, such as Imam Az-Zarnuji's Ta'lim al-Muta'allim, Imam al-Ghazali's Kitab al-Ilm, the Book of Knowledge, and even the writings of Professor Said Naqib al-Attas, to settle the problem of knowledge. And especially with regards to the Kitab al-Ilm, if we can re-establish the pursuit of true knowledge, then inshallah, and as well as the Adab Sulukil Murid of Imam Abdullah bin Alawi al-Haddad, it is hoped that inshallah the pursuit of knowledge can be re-established upon the right footing, and that is to know Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. As Imam Az-Zarnuji said, the first intention that a student of knowledge should set for himself or herself is to attain the rida of Allah, the contentment of Allah. Secondly, izalatul jahal, the removal of ignorance from oneself. And thirdly, in order to establish and consolidate the position of religion in the society. So these are the things that we need to re-establish. And as for the Adab Sulukil Murid of Imam Abdullah ibn Alawi al-Haddad, he was saying that the murid, yes, the seeker, is a person who seeks to strengthen the initial proclivity that Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala has granted. What is meant by this natural proclivity? There is within ourselves a fitrah, a certain tendency to want to return to Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala in a state that He is happy with us. And that is with a sound heart. So as Imam Abdullah ibn Alawi al-Haddad had said in that work, the desire to return to Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala may be occasioned by a number of things. Either fear of death, hope for Jannah, or perhaps the desire of seeking closeness to Allah, or perhaps it may be occasioned by the sight and the gatherings with the men of God, men and women of God, their vision, as well as their words, what these things will do is to occasion upon the heart that natural proclivity, or that initial state of fitrah, the natural inclination to return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But once you experience that, then it behooves the student to study what are the means of strengthening this initial procurement. And to that, Imam al-Haddad devotes an entire treatise, the Adab Sulukil Murid, in order that the process of purification and the process of gradual return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can be done smoothly. I think for our first round, this ought to be sufficient. Why not we have some discussions or some questions or comments?
Jazakumullah khair, Ustaz. I would encourage everyone to ask question if any of you have any. Huh?
You don't have to address the topic directly. If you like to ask
Yeah.
some small small
I
talk stuff, you can ask those things also.
I can sense the clash between the academician and the practices, the one who practice, especially in so-called industries. So I mean, the academician, they say the academician will just talk, but the practice will do it. The one who do it is the doer. So how can we bring these two together? Because the academician will talk theories, but
Mm.
the doer will go down to the levels of we need to do the little things, and then they will just miss out the theories, the aim.
Yes. Well, I think this dichotomy between ilm and amal, knowledge and practice, is not something that we are accustomed to in the religious tradition of Islam. Imam al-Ghazali, he said in the Ayyuhal Walad al-ilmu bila amalin junun, knowledge without practice is just insanity. Wal amalu bila ilmin la yakun, and doing without knowledge will amount to nothing. Also, will be a futility. So that means to say it might appear that the problem is of theory and praxis, but in reality, it's the problem is false knowledge leads to empty practices. So those who claim to be doing, if they do not set on strong and firm and right conceptual foundations, how can they claim to be doing the right things? They might end up being unconscious, unconscious tools to corruption, isn't it? If you think about the factories and those who plan and design the cities, can they design a city that is habitable without them knowing what is the purpose of the city? And if you think about it, uh, many of the corruptions that has been done today rest on the shoulders of the doers who did and unknowingly. And this is not and doing in this sense is not limited to just the construction of buildings and the administering of say medical practices and wrong economic practices resulting from the wrong economic understanding, but it also includes the secularization of the educational practice, isn't it? If the educators and the planners, including those who devise the curriculums, do not understand what is the purpose of knowing, the purpose of knowledge, the purpose of education, how can you claim to be doing what you're meant to do, isn't it? If you're not clear, what is it that you're trying to produce, and how is it that you're supposed to get there, then without these theoretical foundations, the practitioners will end up perhaps even further destroying the conditions.
That's
So
true.
to bridge the gap between the two, of course, you need to to not suffer this dichotomy, and to understand that in Islam, the pursuit of knowledge is a form of amal already, isn't it? The pursuit of knowledge, which is theoretical, is already an amal, and then that amal requires practice. So that means to say there is no dichotomy. The Muslim, as Imam Az-Zarnuji was saying in the Ta'alim Muta'allim, he said the knowledge whose content is wajib or fardu ain, the knowledge whose content is obligatory upon the individual, is al-ilm bil hal, the knowledge that is required for you to live. First, there is the knowledge which is traditionally designed or traditionally labeled as fardu ain, as that which pertains to your ibadah to Allah Subhanahu wa Taala. This one, of course, includes salah, aqidah, includes tasawwuf. But there is the ilmu bil hal, and this is where perhaps it was Muhammad al-Shaybani, or perhaps it was Qadi Abu Yusuf, but it was one of the students of Imam Abu Hanifa, when he was asked, why don't you write a tract on zuhud? A zuhud is a practice which is required. It is wajib. I mean, there is a qadar which is wajib in zuhud. Instead, he wrote a tract on trade and business, because he wanted to ensure that those who conducted themselves in businesses and trades would perform contracts which are halal and would avoid things which are haram in the realm of business. So that means to say, what we need to relearn today is to understand that whatever position you hold within society, supposing you're a teacher, then you'll have to study what is wajib for a teacher to know and what is haram for a teacher to perform, meaning to say in disciplining children, what is allowed, what is not allowed, what is encouraged. Similarly, those who plan and plan cities have to establish the same thing. Those who buy and sell must study those things. The mu'amalah aspects, yes, mu'amalah is practice, but that practice cannot be performed without the required knowledge.
Shukran, Ustaz. There's a question from Brother Muhammad. Um, can you elaborate more on Wa'il's halak's restating Orientalism, meaning on the topic of this focus about self?
Yes. What Wa'il Halak has done in his critique is to expose modern knowledge. To expose that modern knowledge is a grand project of epistemic power, shall we say. Wa'il Halak, in fact, benefited a lot from the developments of social sciences and philosophy in the 20th century. I would say that includes the penetrating study by Michel Foucault. What Foucault had done is to establish that role of power hidden behind epistemology, meaning to say, Foucault's study of madness and sexuality and several other anthropological categories revealed to him, yes, through archival research and through what he called historical archaeology, what he managed to reveal is the power relations that holds between those who have knowledge and those who plan the curriculums and its implementation in society. Particularly when you study the similarities inherent in the prison system and the educational enterprise and the factories, there is a uncanny resemblance between all these three. But that a prison is a correctional facility, and a school is a place in order to produce good citizens, at least in the Western conception, and the asylum and the hospitals. Why is it that they have this very similar aim and similar structure? And this exposes, according to Foucault, the power balance. And of course, many people take influence from that. The feminists, the several other movements, they try to use this narrative to counter it in order to bring forth their own power narrative. But this is no way to break this false conception of knowledge. In truth, what is missing in this, and perhaps Wa'il Halak only points to it, he doesn't give full commitment to the Islamic or any other Eastern tradition, but he wishes to point to the possibility at the very least. Because when we look at history in the Islamic intellectual tradition, or the study of Sharia, or the study of history in other traditions like the Chinese tradition, there is always if you study, say, any of these historiographies, there is always a tendency to show what is of value, what needs to be inculcated, what needs to be produced. So when people studied and read history in the past, history is part of adabiyat, and adabiyat is not just restricted to literature, which is also meant to consolidate praiseworthy character, there is something lost, of course, in human knowledge also, because when you look at Plato, in his Republic, he was saying that there are also certain elements of music that produces certain good character, and there are certain other music, and not just the lyrics, but the rhythms and the melody that is injurious to the development of character. So, so therefore, education, knowledge, history, all has this relation, or rather, all has this function of ethicizing a human being, not the modern knowledge as criticized by Wael Halak.
Thank you so much. Uh, uh, Waiting for more questions from people. Maybe Brother Azim can ask question from in relation to permaculture.
Trying to formulate my thoughts.
Oh, I can see Qayyum is also here.
Yes, yes. Qayyim, alhamdulillah.
Yes, and
That's it. Okay.
okay, this is Ashraf. Yes, can you read the question, Hussein?
Okay. Oh, it's a long one. The relationship, I think you should read it yourself. I think
Let me see.
it's very long.
Okay. The relationship between knowledge and man was once viewed in the East as a garden to be cultivated, medieval societies a city to be governed, a machine to be put to work. However, the machine of man has now begun forays into areas of knowledge, such as singularity, tact, and AI, which pose great theological question. For such areas of knowledge involve questions of omniscience and omnipresence, which cannot be resolved secularly. Is the problem of knowledge also a problem of theology? Then pure epistemology. Well, of course, when we think about it in this sense, let us say that the age of post-modernism is said to be the age of the collapse of meta narratives. But we know amongst several leading theorists of modernity, they are not in unison to say that there is such a thing as post-modernity. Zygmunt Bauman talks about liquid modernity. Others speak about late modernity, like Marshall Berman, who wrote this, all that is solid melts into air. But let us say, yes, late modernity, second modernity, multiple modernities, and post-modernity, this conception of, say, the era that we live in proceeds from that optimism in human reason in the Enlightenment period, which is the age of the movement of society from belief in God, from the inculcation of ethics as part and parcel of education. And if you look at, say, the writings of Christopher Dawson, what he does is to show that unless Western culture returns back to its Christian foundations, then they will suffer, several grave problems, because they cannot continue living within the secular and secular space. The secularity here is a space that is created from the secularization of Christianity. That means to say that baggage is never really something that they can disengage themselves with. But as you rightly point out, as there are certain genuine discoveries and genuine techniques in AI, in computer science, and even in philosophy in this regard, they continue to try to answer and to ask metaphysical questions that will always emerge some way or another. I mean, in the early 20th century, perhaps some of them tried to reject metaphysics using language. Others tried to do so using the verification criteria and so on and so forth. But yet they always, because the world is in the Islamic metaphysical scheme, it is part and parcel of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's ayat. It is from the realm of the athar of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's actions, which ensue from his asma wa sifah, which ensues from his zat. Anyway they go, as the deeper they study, they will find the science of metaphysics, nevertheless. Sanurihim ayatina minal afaq wa fi anfusihim. We shall surely reveal unto them our signs in the horizons as well as within themselves. Hatta yatabayana annahu huwal haq, until it becomes clear that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the truth, most exalted. In other words, as they advance their computer technology and they reach questions of transcendence and omniscience and omnipotence, they come to the recognition of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala they come to recognize and understand deeper that. And as they go deeper into the cognitive sciences, they will find, inherent and deep structures of system. And similarly, as they go into the horizons, as they go deeper into quantum mechanics and physics, they will find, elements of the traces of God's grace upon the universe. Either they will be guided or not. Well, as Prof. al-Attas was saying, if they stubbornly cling on to their own reason, then they will be like those who istawqada naran, who try to set fire in the deep night, that as soon as they get some clues, ذهب الله بنورهم, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala removes their light. But as for those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala choose to guide, then they will be so guided. But for Muslims, the road and the path remains always open. I mean, the adab sulukil murid. Yes, for as long as you're willing to undergo sayr wa suluk, to undergo self-purification and to pursue right and true knowledge, the door remains open for your verification with your heart.
Thank you, Habib, and sorry for my grammatical errors.
It's overlooked, certainly. I think there is another question.
Another question from Brother Qayyim. I would like him to read it himself.
Yes.
Go on, Brother Qayyim.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I first of all, thank you for the sharing session. Apologize that I couldn't engage as much. I'm actually currently occupied with work, but I have one question, if I may. I realize that in Malaysia nowadays, I mean maybe not nowadays, but recently, or even before, that the term Orientalist has been quite pervasive in the society, especially amongst our ascetiza. And I realize that their conception is pretty different from the conception of Said. It's actually pretty, I think the desperation is quite huge. Like, as you have mentioned, Said defines Orientalism as the study of the West alongside with their, let's say, bias. But
yes.
The one that been used by our asatiza or even doctor or professors here in Malaysia, I think it's much more heavy, if not erroneous. Like for example, they always blame the Orientalists to that they brought the liberal ideas to the Muslim world, for example, but they put more emphasis on the Muslim, like everything that they blame the Orientalists for, everything that our, let's say, something that we have done wrong, our ideologies, so they always blame on the Orientalists. What do you think? Is that so?
Well, of course, I think that's part and parcel of psychology, isn't it? If you want control over people, create an enemy. But I can understand perhaps that it might be something that has snowballed over time. perhaps there were certain individual figures amongst the Orientalists who did serve colonial and imperial interests. I can imagine the likes of perhaps, the usual suspects include, of course, Hugronia, and perhaps several others amongst those who were actively involved in the state apparatus. So in those cases, it's very difficult to distinguish between the objective scholarly research and the interests of their sponsors. But that being said, when we look at I think one good work that has been written in our language, or the Indonesian language, is by Professor Shamsuddin Arif, the work on diabolism, pemikiran Orientalis, or something like that, the diabolical nature of some writings of some Orientalists. In particular, the deliberate distortion of the meaning of Islam, but that too need not necessarily have a direct, a direct evil-bearing conspiracy sort of thing, but more due to the prejudices. And the earlier you go, the worse, I suppose, were the prejudices that were afforded. And this is perhaps because of the long-standing confrontation between Western culture, Western Christian culture, and Islam. And if you remember that, the earlier you go, in the 13th and the 14th centuries, when they first started translating the Quran into Latin, yes, it's that book, Muhammad. But when you look at the earlier period, and if you read perhaps Henry Pirren's Muhammad and Charlemagne, and several other authors, their settled aversion against Islam was much more pronounced in the early periods. And that is perhaps because of, this is another peculiar feature of Western culture that has been pointed out by Remy Bragg. Remy Bragg, he wrote a book on Western culture. It's called perhaps Eccentric Culture, A Theory of Western Civilization. He puts forth a very interesting supposition. He was saying that Western culture is defined by secondarity as a deliberate category. In other words, it is called inverse adoption as part and parcel of their culture. They are people who knowingly adopt, superior forms of culture from other cultures. In other words, the model of Western culture is not Greek or the Hebrew civilization, but it is the Roman civilization, because it is the Romans that borrowed extensively from the Greek pantheon and the Greek philosophy and several other very important dominant conceptions of their culture, including, of course, the absorption of the elements of ethics and religious ethics and theology from the Judeo-Christian elements. So Romanity is part of that Western culture. And so when modern Europe absorbed or rather repeated that character trait, what Remy Bragg pointed out was that they are very, shall we say, they have a certain sense of hatred towards those whom they borrowed directly from, meaning to say they refuse to acknowledge, and in fact they have a certain sense of hatred towards those they borrowed directly from. And in this case, it was Islamic culture and civilization, especially because they were conquered by the Muslims in several places, but more importantly because of that direct attribution of the cultural borrowing from Arabia. I think Dimitri Gutas wrote a very a good work on this. How the Western how the Arabs transmitted Aristotelian culture into Christianity. So therefore, this long-standing confrontation between the West and Islam is not something that they can just look past. It is only more recently, and even back then, although they were very genuine Orientalists whose pursuit and whose passion for the study of Islam and the East was done very well. There were others also who were, who suffered their own prejudices based on perhaps their secularized worldview. But what I do agree with your your general criticism of our, I don't know lah, our asatiza as a whole, or some people amongst ourselves who are is their lack of nuance. But these things, I mean, remember how recently they have, misdescribed liberalism, and their misunderstanding, um, only betrays their lack of studies and research. Similarly, I suppose with their understanding of Orientalism is a caricature of who the Orientalists are. But to do this, to remedy this, it establishes further the role of centers such as CASIS and other places to publish, to share from time to time, disseminate their understanding of a big category such as Orientalism, liberalism, and secularism. Otherwise, we will suffer the caricature, and we will suffer the lack of nuance, and we will have to suffer the outright misrepresentation, even of those who stand diametrically opposed to what we hold. But I thank you for your critical comments.
Thank you, Ustaz. But do you think that the notion or the term Orientalist that we use have the root, or not that we, but the let's say the Asatiza use, or all of these people, Said, or
Yes.
maybe it comes from other earlier sources, probably?
It's possible. I mean, it's not difficult to imagine if they have not read Said. But Said doesn't possess the monopoly of what Orientalism is. But at the very least, even if they want to say they want to jettison and not read Said, that's fine. If they have referred to the right sources and they have read the proper authorities, and at the very least understood the whole apparatus. I can say that if they misreading Said, they can still develop a nuanced and sophisticated understanding of Orientalists, perhaps by studying, Professor Hussein al-Attas's Myth of Lazy Natives, and perhaps a combination of Walter Mignolo and Professor Wa'il Halak and several others who have tried to point out um, the uses or the misuses of knowledge that is utilized by some of these Western scholars. I mean, the same can be said of the understanding of the West. I mean, I used to teach students at a college, and for them, when we say Barat or Western culture, they understand it as like the enemy, like in a boogeyman sense of the thing, that these people are evil and so on and so forth. But we have to be. I suppose that's the imagination at work. But we are not the only people who suffer from this. I mean, those who lack basically those who lack a healthy and robust knowledge culture will tend to do the same. The general population who's fed a steady diet of Fox News and and whatever else that they watch might have an analogous understanding of Islam, isn't it?
Right. Thank
So
you.
to remedy this, we need a healthy knowledge culture.
Right. Right.
There's a question on the book. Where is it? Is this the book Islam and Diabolism Intellectual by Shamsuddin, Dr. Shamsuddin?
Yes, Dr. Shamsuddin. That's a very good book. I mean, because Dr. Shamsuddin is a very respectable scholar. He studied in Germany and he's done his sources. I took several classes with him, but the one that we were exposed to some Orientalist writings was his teaching the Ulum al-Quran and the Ulum al-Hadith, which is very interesting. I mean, to take Ulum al-Quran, or Introduction to the Sciences of the Quran and Sciences of the Hadith, with Dr. Shamsuddin is really a master's class in the true sense of the word, because what he would do is to, we took it over maybe one semester, and then we repeated it in the perhaps when he offered it again. But the way he would teach it is such that not only did he give us an introduction to the best sources in the Islamic sense, meaning to say when we want to study, say, hadith, he introduced us to not only the kutub as-sittah, which is basic, I mean an understanding of what they mean, but he introduced us to the commentaries of the Bukhari, yes, like the Irshad Asari, the Fathul Bari, and several others, and the Muslim, and then he introduced us to the Mustalah, the science of the terminologies used in hadith studies, and the Quran, the same, tafsir, qiraat, and so on. But at the same time, these things, I suppose you could, because he was also traditionally trained, you could get it in traditional centers of learning. But at the same time, he introduced us also to the Orientalist challenges of the studies on Quran and Hadith, and this is where we get to learn about Joseph Schacht's understanding of Islamic jurisprudence and his and the various accusations he put forth against Hadith, his views that later on came to be translated into Malay by a local scholar who tried to challenge the veracity of Hadith as a whole. And at the same time, we also got to meet, in writing at least, the Orientalists who tried to challenge the veracity of the Quran, which is answered very powerfully by Dr. Mustafa Azami. So basically, despite the Quran and Hadith being a divinely revealed, the Quran being divinely revealed scripture, and the science of Hadith having reached, its maturity in the early periods, but yet there's so many things that has developed in these fields that a Muslim needs to be updated.
There's a question from Brother Azim. You want to read it yourself?
Yes, why not you read it,
Okay.
Abdul Azim, so I can hear your voice.
Okay, inshallah. Walaikum Ustaz.
Alaikum salam.
Hang on. So it's a bit long, huh? Okay, so as we know, please correct me if I'm wrong. Like, knowledge is wajib upon us to learn, as the need for it is upon us, such that a person who enters Islam at the time of the Zuhur prayer, it is obligatory upon him and priority upon him to learn how to perform Zuhur prayer. But at the moment, maybe not yet how to in learning how to fast in Ramadan, since it's not Ramadan yet. This is correct, right, Ustaz?
Yes.
Okay, so so in our time, the industrial civilization has brought unprecedented ecological destruction, and which is still going on at a catastrophic rate, and on different fronts and aspects. For example, in agriculture, in resource extraction, and this whole consumerism, this whole mindless production and waste. So our ability to destroy the earth now is far greater now than our ability to restore it. So we are really lacking the capacity now, for example, the knowledge of proper land use to produce good food, real food, let alone to restore ecosystems. So in view of this current state of urgency in regards to these matters, how do you see, Ustaz, the place of practical knowledge, such as growing food in a wholesome way, in a tayyib way, and ecosystem restorations and the likes of this in the whole hierarchy of knowledge acquisition?
Yes. Well, of course, any success that we hope to achieve must not ignore previous models of success. The most important being that of the prophetic example, because that has been sanctioned in the Quran. So Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala said, "Laqad kana lakum fi Rasulillah uswatun hasanah." that indeed in the person of the Prophet is the best example for whoever that wishes to attain the contentment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and success in the hereafter. And at the same time, when we say the Prophet Muhammad, we do not merely distinguish him as an individual, although that is established, but we also distinguish the generation that he inculcated with him, the Sahaba, because they are truly the ones that has been praised by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as being the best people that has been seen by mankind. Kuntum khaira ummatin ukhrijat linnas. So the condition of their being able to perform their tasks in the most excellent way is that first they have to have iman iman of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the afterlife. And these are two foundations, yes, imperturbable foundations that becomes the foundation for all the actions that will ensue, which includes ta'muruna bil ma'ruf wa tanhauna 'anil munkar, that you would do the things which are good and you would then prevent those things which are evil. Based on this foundation is also established the imperative of goodness in Islam, wa ta'awanu bil birri wa taqwa, yes, that you have to assist and to help each other in things which are good and the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that you're not supposed to aid each other and help each other bil ithmi wal udwan on things which are destructive and enmity between mankind. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also spoke about the generality of humankind is in a state of loss except for those who have iman and those who encourage each other in patience, yes, and al-haq, the truth, which includes, of course, the right actions that you talked about. And then in another verse, Allah said, وَتَوَسَّوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَسَّوْا بِالصَّبْرِ وَتَوَسَّوْا بِالْمَرْحَمَةِ, also love and mercy. Why we say this is because sometimes we might not lack the technical know-how of how to improve things, but what we lack, as Professor al-Attas was saying, is the knowledge of how to control ourselves, the knowledge of how to keep at doing good when we are tempted to do evil, how not to compromise on our principles. Because any good thing that we are to do, the Prophet said that, alaykum bil jama'ah, that you are supposed to do things as a group, as a collective. And as a collective, you are more able to accomplish great things than when you perform as individuals. The things that you speak about are immense and important. But right now, as we have seen in the past 100 years or so, anything that requires collective action towards the good will suffer when the collective suffers betrayal from within. Supposing they say that, let us join together for an educational enterprise. But as soon as the enterprise kicks off, and then somebody within it may betray it in order to earn a quick buck or something like that. Or somebody else might suffer, as the Prophet said, there are a group of people who will continue to protect this religion from three people or from three groups. One of them are the plagiarists, meaning to say those who have done nothing themselves, but they claim it to be theirs. The second group are the extremists. And then third group are the jahil, the ignorant. So if you think about anything that requires collective actions, these three groups are threats. So therefore, when Professor Naqib al-Attas tried to solve this issue, he goes to the very root. The very root of the problem, as become apparent now, is what we see is the shall we say, rise of false leaders in all spheres. And leaders are people who move followers. So all the major initiatives that is required in our time are peopled by false leaders. These false leaders, they are able to emerge in a situation of the rampant loss of adab in society. Meaning to say, when the condition of things not being put in the proper place becomes rampant, when people lack self-respect, self-mastery, then what tends to happen is that they will allow amongst themselves the rise of false leaders. But the root of that is the corruption of knowledge. So so how Professor Nakib al-Attas intends to improve the situation is that you must, of course, begin with adab of seeking knowledge, but you must restore adab in society. Once the adab is restored, once society is peopled by true human beings who understand at the prior most level is the ability for the nafsul natiqah, the intellectual spiritual self, to gain control of the nafsul haywaniyah. Once you have that, and you have a critical mass, you have a critical mass of such groups of people who are, as Prof. al-Attas was saying in the second preface of Islam and Secularism, those who are conscious of their Islamic identity, and once it reaches full maturity, they are able to perform great tasks, including what you are talking about. But as for the imperative to do so, there is no doubt. I mean, the Prophet ﷺ said in the hadith, "Badiru bil a'mal," that you have to be quick, you have to hasten towards good actions and good initiatives. He said before 7 things. The Prophet said, "Are you to wait for poverty?" Yes, faqran mansiya, poverty that makes you forget. In other words, that makes you forget your religious duty, that makes you forget your ethical duty. Or ghinan, or riches that corrupts you. And we see now the effects of riches corrupting people. There are people who say before coming across riches, people who are principled, people who intend on ethical projects, but they come across such vast amounts of wealth that they become corrupt overnight. Yes, so riches that corrupt. And then thirdly, a kind of sudden sickness that befalls you. Yes, a sudden sickness that befalls you, then rendering you unable to function properly. And then fourthly, an attack upon your sanity, either causing you to suffer from, say, old Alzheimer's and things of that sort, loss of consciousness. Fifth, sudden death. And now we come to see those things at a greater persistence with the pandemic, with multiple crises on our shores. Now we can see now what the Prophet was saying is slowly coming slowly coming out. But number 6 and number 7 relates to things which are still hidden of the eschatology. Number 6 is the Dajjal. He said, "Fahuwa sharrul ghaibul yuntadhar." It is the worst of the things of the unseen that is being awaited. And then 7, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ends the world. Even so, yes, these 5, yes, before the Khuruj al-Dajjal, before his coming out, these 5 requires, initiatives of the things that you say. If you think about it, poverty, in order to combat poverty, it is insufficient to just simply to work, isn't it? But you must create opportunities for work to happen. And health would include your concerns for food security. Health would include your concern for real food and so on. So that would mean all the things that you say are subsumed under the good initiatives which are required for our very tumultuous and challenging times. But just try to imagine the sort of manpower that is required, human power that is required, commitments, ethical commitments, religious commitments which are required. Because certainly those things that you try to bring out will require major amounts of sacrifices that a consumerist age like ours are very difficult to wean off, isn't it? One of the reasons why capitalism is so persistent in our time, despite of the greater amount of information available now of the extent of the corruption that's happening, is precisely due to our own weaknesses. So therefore, I think our best bet would be, in order for us to be able to sustain such efforts, which are nonetheless wajib, we must do that which is prior, which is to establish our ethical and religious commitments on a solid basis. Because contrary to the Islamic worldview, Western culture and civilization provides no such commitments, to the extent that theirs is a fragile type of goodness. It is a goodness that is not immune to tragedy. Meaning to say, all that is required is for one thing to go wrong before they let go of their commitments. But we have, predecessors to show to us great examples of people who are willing to suffer death while remaining true to their commitments, and that is the basic meaning of shahada. The basic meaning of shahada is to commit to the oneness of God, to the tawhid of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and all the ethical commitments it entails, even if you were to suffer death. So that's why the first shahid in the history of Islam was Sumayyah. She was a lady. It wasn't in warfare that she became a martyr, but it was in the defense of her shahada, in the defense of her faith. Likewise, her husband. And look at the extent that Bilal ibn Rabah was willing to go to in order to hold on to his principle of commitment to the ahad, to the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So similarly, in our case, you can find analogous situations. Of course, it would be good for such initiatives if there are people who are from differing faiths, differing metaphysical commitments. If they find themselves committed enough, then, ahlan wa sahlan, they can join in such good initiatives. Our effort now is to establish what Professor al-Attas had done, is to draw the, in a diagrammatic manner, what is the most required, which is the fardu ain. But he draws it in a progressive, circle type of way, such that, there are certain overlaps of what people with different metaphysical commitments may have in terms of ethical commitments, such that we can work together even with people of different faiths and so on.
When you say draws, does he literally draw it?
Yes, you can find it in Islam and Secularism in the chapter, in the 5th chapter.
Okay, right. I think we're gonna get one more question, if there is any, or we can end the session because it's already 10 to 11.
Okay.
Jazakallah, Ustad, for your insights.
All right. If there are no more questions, how do you feel about meeting again next week?
Yeah.
Okay.
How is that even a question?
I definitely don't mind.
Inshallah.
Okay.
I definitely gonna ask you if you don't ask first, because it's your time to borrow.
Inshallah, next week, same time.
Okay, that sounds excellent.
So
Yes, and
this is
if you
going
have-
to be
Yes?
a weekly.
Weekly
event?
thing.
Amin.
Yeah, well, let's not get too excited, But if you have questions along the way, write them down, and perhaps we can discuss together, inshallah.
There's an iklan from Brother Azhar.
Okay.
Pengenalan. You want to say it, Brother Azhar?
Inshallah.
Apa?
Mahvid, ada regarding this the majlis of Dr. Helmi Ramli.
Oh, okay. Yes. Silakan, Azhar.
Yes. So insyaAllah this Sunday kita ada majlis di Muar dengan Dr. Helmi Ramli. The topic will be pengenalan pandangan alam Islam dan cabaran dualisme and humanisme dan tragedi. Okay, insyaAllah Ahad pukul 10 pagi di Muar.
Ada online ke?
Tak pasti, rasanya kita tengok. I will try to put it online lah, live stream maybe dekat dasar Facebook, insyaAllah. Okay, so kalau ada yang ke lapangan nak turun Muar cari mi Bandung, dan maybe boleh datang this majlis.
Tadi itu Brother Azhar.
InsyaAllah.
Lewat.
Okay, thank you. Barakallahu fiik.
All right. I think we're gonna end the session tonight. Inshallah, we're gonna meet again next week, hopefully, and then the following weeks. You wanna end with the dua, or want me to end?
But before that, how about the topic?
Oh, well, I think unless you guys have questions along the way,
Mhm.
I'm thinking of explaining further the project of modernity.
Okay, so we need to prepare.
Yes.
Any reading recommendations, Habib?
Well, you can read any books that you have on modernity. If you have Habermas's philosophical discourse on modernity, that's good. There's a book that might be of interest to architects such as Hussein. You can read Marshall Berman's All That Is Solid Melts into Air. But otherwise, you can do your own exploration. It's good if you read other things, so that way when you ask the question, it will spice things up.
All right. Will do.
So
Inshallah, I'll end with the dua. Perhaps.
yes, please do, Hussein. You're going to end with the dua.
Yeah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dua by is written by Al-Habib Ahmad bin Umar bin Sumaid. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. ربنا انفعنا بما علمتنا ربي علمنا الذي ينفعنا ربي فقنا فق أهلنا وقرابات لنا في ديننا مع القتل أنثى وذكر ربي وفقنا وفقهم لما ترتضي قولا وفعلا كرما وارزقي كل هلالا دائما وأخلا أتي علماء نهضى بالخير ونكفى كل شر ربنا أسره لنا كل شؤون وأخر بالرضا منك العيون واقضي عنا ربنا كل الديون قبل أن تأتينا رسل المنون واغفر أنت أكرم من ستر وصلاة الله تغشى المصطفى من إله قيد عنا والوفاء بكتاب فيه للناس شفاء وعلى الآل الكرام شرفاء وعلى الصحب المصاب الغران اللهم اهدنا بهداك واجعلنا ممن يسارع في رضاك ولا تولنا وليا سواك ولا تجعلنا ممن خالف أمرك وعصاك وحسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين آمين يا رب العالمين.